Welcome to the State Network podcast. I am Jim Sparks, and I am here with Lieutenant Melissa Jones. Hello, Lieutenant Melissa Jones.
Hey, Jim. How you doing?
Good. Well, as good as can be during these times.
Yes.
Lieutenant Melissa Jones is currently the Corps officer in Santa Clarita, which is just outside of Los Angeles, probably mostly known for being close to Magic Mountain. Is that about right?
That's about right. Yeah.
Prior to being an officer, she was our territorial child safety director. And among her many accomplishments, one of the biggest ones I would imagine was that she passed a California state bar exam. When did you do that?
That was in 2011.
That is a major, major deal. And Lieutenant Melissa is the kind of person that you walk away from conversations a better person. I got to work with her for a couple of years while she was at THQ, and I learned quite a bit through our conversations. And she's always someone that I could count on to kind of put things in a perspective that really helped me figure some things out. And so I appreciate that. But as sad as I was that she left THQ, I am very, very excited that she is now serving as a full-time pastor. That's a big deal, Lieutenant Melissa Jones. You have your own congregation. And how long have you been in Santa Clarita?
A little over 6 months now.
Yeah, fresh. And
yeah.
So you've barely even had in-person meetings, have you?
Yeah, so I jumped right into Christmas, and then we were kind of cleaning up from that, getting things going, and boom, COVID hit, and now we've got this. But we're going to get back to in-person meetings really soon, so good. I'm happy about that.
What a crazy adventure! Not only all of us are in, but certainly what you're in as well. Before we get into the episode, we always take a minute to talk about a youth culture piece or resource, and in this case, it's a youth culture piece. I will include the link in the show notes. But this is, again, from Fuller Youth Institute. It's a source that I like to highlight regularly because they have good stuff. But the title of this was 3 Changes You Need to Know About Young People as You Minister During and After the Pandemic. And we are still very much in the middle of a pandemic. As Melissa said, that we're starting to work our way back to regular in-person church services, but we're still amidst the pandemic. And so the 3 main topics is many don't know who to trust. And I think that's not just limited for youth. I think there's been so much information coming out of different things on what's right, what's wrong, how to do things. And so there's this kind of level of maybe mistrust. And it's not like that we think or you think that people are lying. It's just, there's just so many hard things about the information that comes out and how maybe people are feeling. But it's very difficult. The second being, many are uncertain about their futures. In fact, I read a piece yesterday about because there is no summer camps, and the trouble that brings long term, and it's something I didn't really consider until reading this, is that young people, in particular people of lower socioeconomic levels, tend to really, really benefit of having camp on the resume and being able to work at a camp and have that as experience. And the Salvation Army has been very, very good about that. We hire people as young as 14 years of age and from all walks of life. And 100 or so just in Southern California get hired, but I would say across the territory, it's probably close to 1,000 young people will get hired and are able to put that on the resume, and they miss out on a year of that. And so that kind of brings some unsettledness. A lot of it, the uncertainty has to do with colleges changing their system and online learning or not being able to afford things now because of the economic times. There's a lot of uncertainty there. And then the third is, sorry, I just missed my spot here, is that simply that there's work not available. I don't know the number of how many millions of Americans are currently been laid off, but work is just not readily available. And so it's going to take time for particularly young people, young adults, to get back into the workforce as things go. And the longer it takes, the less maybe opportunities they have to do things because funds are just not simply available. But Melissa, as you kind of are preparing, how does this stuff kind of reflect the population that you serve? How does this affect?
So I serve a pretty low income community. Santa Clarita does have a lot of money. If you drive around, you're probably going to see some nice houses, but where I am, the population is primarily Hispanic, and we have a lot of, we have some homeless in the area that we serve, as well as a lot of the families are first generation immigrants to the country. A good portion of them undocumented. A lot of the parents do struggle with the English language, and working with the schools. We've been working actively with some of the social workers from our local schools just to see how we can help people, but also the families that get hit by COVID, that are working jobs where if you don't show up, you lose your job, kind of thing. And so I've really seen how that's impacted the families that we serve, the young people that we serve. Last year, I think Santa Clarita sent about 180 kids to camp from this community. And we were going to send and working with the schools prior to COVID to send almost as many kids this year. And it's a huge respite for them. A lot of them are living in housing where there's just maybe 1 or 2 bedrooms for 5 to 8 people sometimes. A lot of them live in shared houses or shared spaces. This was the same case when I worked in Santa Ana as the assistant corps officer there. I remember one family was a family of 7 living in 1 bedroom. And the fact that their oldest son was able to go to camp and work last summer was a huge blessing for him, a huge respite for him. And so when I heard this, I thought of all those kids, all those families, the young people that we serve that aren't going to get that bit of respite this summer. And it does break my heart a little, especially for those that, but we're trying to work with schools, we're trying to work with local groups to make sure that at least they're provided for physically, that they have the food that they need. We have Cal Arts delivering 150 meals every day to one of the local schools. So we're trying to make sure that these kids are provided for, and also trying to see in the next few weeks how we can provide some sort of, virtual class or VBS, something we can do this summer just to give them some activities. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, it certainly has my brain kind of working in a different way, just that job resume type stuff. And what can we do to do resume builders for kids, young adults, because it's critical. Just even if you're the dishwasher at camp, an employer is going to see that and say that this person has been committed to something and did it well. And you have a resume, you have references that could help you out. And so, definitely an area that we all really need to look at. I would encourage everyone to read this article, and most of us are kind of thinking this way, but this is kind of very specific stuff that we could be thinking about when our people do come back, which is soon. And in some cases, in parts of this territory, they're already kind of back. Some of our Croc centers have opened and cores have opened. And so, but things aren't going to be back to normal, and they're not going to be normal when we come back. And we might need to pivot, even in our ministries. As we pivoted without going to the core, we might have to pivot how we do normal youth ministry, young adult ministry, back when everyone comes back. So interesting times, but it's a lot. But there's some very good examples of what people have been able to do during this time and what are going to be doing. And so I have quite a bit of hope and optimism that we'll actually come out of this better in the end.
Yeah.
let's get into it. Melissa, first, for those that don't know, can you share just a little bit about yourself and how you eventually became an officer?
Yeah, I grew up in the Salvation Army. Both of my parents are officers. My younger sister is now an officer. It's sort of a family deal at this point. But, growing up, I never wanted to be an officer. I loved, especially when I was younger, going to the Corps. And as a teenager, you're kind of like, oh, why are you dragging me here? But I still enjoyed being in the Salvation Army when I went to college in New York. I was a regular participant in the Corps there, actively participating. And even throughout law school, I was still actively participating in my Corps. Always had a heart for justice, for helping others. And that's particularly why I continue to support our Corps in Compton and in an area where I could interact and be with people who are a little different from me, living a different life than I was living, but also just to commune with one another multiculturally in the name of Christ. And I was sort of on that path. Like I said, I went to law school. I took the bar in New York and California, and I was moving forward, working with Christian Legal Aid of Los Angeles. I was volunteering a lot with them, trying to get a job with them. And I kept looking for legal jobs, working through either supporting lawyers who were supporting education, special education, lawyers who were supporting immigrants' rights, etc. Those were kind of the areas I was looking for, human trafficking. And things just weren't coming together. I eventually got a job at CFOT, pay my bills and whatnot. And then eventually got offered the job at THQ, which was a huge surprise, but also a huge blessing for me. And I think throughout that time, God was preparing me just to open my heart to what he ultimately wanted to do. Like I said, since I was a kid, I wanted to be a lawyer. That was my goal. I had met my goal. I was working in some place where I was advocating for kids and human rights and still volunteering, helping to support immigrants' rights and those who have been trafficked. And I thought that's where my next step was going to be. But the Lord had different plans. And I'd been praying because I felt like some uncomfortableness, some dissonance within my soul while I was working at THQ. And not that I didn't love my job there. It was difficult. It was really challenging. But I did know that God called me to be in that space at that time. But I felt like God was asking me for a little bit more. So I'd really been praying about it. And we went to the Boundless International Congress in London. And while I was there, God really started to, actively speak to me about the next steps that he wanted me to take. And I could see how God could use the skills, because that was my thing. Like, God, I'm a lawyer. What are you going to do with me as a pastor? Like, I really don't know if that's one of my giftings. And, but he really opened my eyes to all that the Army's doing around the world, all that he could do through me around the world, and really spoke when the general and other people were giving a call. God was like, I call you. And so I very clearly heard God's voice. And from that point on, I listened and obeyed, because at this point in my life, I've learned what it means to not obey God. And I'm already in my 30s by this point, and I was like, you know what? This is what God's calling me to do. I've got to do it. And so started on that path to become an officer.
Well, I mean, how lucky are we in the Salvation Army that God has called you to serve him in this capacity. And we're just incredibly lucky for that. Before we get into the rest of the questions, can you define what injustice is?
Well, Jim, in order to define what injustice is, we first have to define what justice is, because injustice is basically not living up to that ideal. Micah 6:8 provides a really great foundation for this, for establishing what justice is. It says that, what does the Lord require of you? But to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. this word for justice, translated in Hebrew, means that people get what they're due, that they get the rights owed to them. And this word has to work in combination with the other two directives in this verse. The mercy we are to provide is the unending love of Christ, the love of God. And in doing so, we not only walk humbly with our brothers and sisters, but we walk humbly with God. And so when we put these three things together, to give people what they are owed, but then to go a step further and add into that we are supposed to love them with the never-ending love of Christ, and to submit not only humbly before our God, but before them. So this is justice, that everybody receives the rights that they are due because they are created in the image of God, that we love them with the never-ending love of Christ, and which really to me means that we give them more than what they are due, because from God we receive more really than what we actually deserve. And in humility, we try to understand our brothers and sisters, understand their walk, and stand in solidarity with them as we fight the injustices that are happening to them. Some examples that I can think of are poverty. We can think of racial inequality, wealth inequality. We can think of gender inequality. Anytime that somebody is not receiving their divine rights as somebody created in the image of God, anytime somebody is not being loved with the love of God, that's when there is injustice in the world.
Wow. Thank you for that, Melissa. Powerful stuff there. So you recently wrote an article for Caring Magazine, which is, I'll put a link in the show notes on this, titled, I always feel like I say this wrong, Imago Dei?
I think you said that right. I'm not sure if I say it right. So
it's weird. It's always one that I read a certain way. I'm like, this is how I read it. And I don't know if it's right, and I should ask. But
that sounds proper to me.
But my Imago Dei matters. What is Imago Dei?
Imago Dei is, I'm pretty sure it's Greek or Latin for image of God. So this comes from the fact that in creation, in the first chapter of Genesis, right, when God created the world and everything in it, he created human beings differently from the rest of creation. Like he brought forth light, he brought forth water and earth, and from the earth came plants, and then he created animals. And then all of a sudden he stops and creates human beings, or Adam, like we know Adam and Eve, but like the Adam literally means like human being. So he creates the Adam in his image. And in the image of God, he created them. And this is in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 27. And he talks about how male and female, he created them in his image. And as people, that means like we are imprinted with the image of God on us. And if you think about what that means, that this perfect God, this all-loving God, this all-powerful God. Now, we are not endowed with all of the characteristics of God, but he did create us to be his image here on earth, to spread his goodness, to spread his love. And for the short time that we remained in a state of perfection, right, we had this perfect relationship with God. We had this perfect relationship with one another where we weren't sinning against one another. We weren't sinning against God. And then all of a sudden that's broken. We have this broken relationship with God, and we have this broken relationship with one another. But that doesn't mean that we don't strive to treat each other, even though we have this broken relationship in the image of God, still being like little images of God kind of on the earth, spreading his goodness and love, and treating each other equally, treating each other righteously, and trying to create these holy relationships with one another to move past the brokenness that and sinfulness that we are. And so if it's basically the notion that, like, I'm looking at you, Jim, and I see the image of God in you. And if I see the image of God in you, how can I tarnish that image? And how, if I see the image of God imprinted upon you, I see you as my brother in Christ. We are both created in the same image. We are both equal. How do we tarnish that? How do we tear that down? How can we tear that down? And so we have to uphold ourselves and treat ourselves as worthy, simply for no other reason than we're both created in the image of God. We both have God's imprint stamped upon us, and that is a hugely valuable thing that we should honor in one another.
Yeah. That was just a beautiful sermon, but just it's incredible how much that really does matter. And in that article you shared how racism has both not just affected you but your family, and in many ways it continues to, not just when you were little, but as you've gotten older as well. What advice do you give to youth leaders when young people share that they have been a victim of racism?
So I think as youth leaders, one, you should be preparing yourself beforehand to have these conversations. So you should be knowledgeable about it, because somebody is going to have this conversation with you. Somebody is going to come forward with this. It's just inevitable. So
well, we hope, right?
Yeah, we hope. And one, so if you're not a person of color, if you're white or Caucasian, however you want to say that, if racism is not something that you've experienced, if you do not experience bias in your life, you want to study up on that. Maybe you have a close friend that can maybe talk you through some of these things. Like, you say, hey man, what are some of the experiences that you have gone through? Can you share those with me? Can you share how that's affected you? Because I want to learn, I want to see, and I want to feel the things that you have gone through. I want to empathize with you. And there are books that you can read. You can study about the language that's appropriate. Look around at your congregation, look around at the youth that you serve, and see what language is appropriate to be using. Look up what racism is. Look up what the definition of racism. Be familiar with what ethnicity means and culture means, and how to positively talk about those things, and positively respect one another in a space where you have a lot of cultures. So I think that's the first thing as a youth pastor, is that you want to be prepared to have these conversations. And if you feel like you can't be prepared, or that you're too far away from the situation to understand, like, bring a friend along with you. There's no shame in that, and saying, hey, I need some help with this. Can you help me talk about it? Because for me, I'm mixed race woman. If a young Black male comes, I can talk to him, but he's not going to receive the same care as if I bring one of my brothers along, somebody from either my family or the church that can really kind of relate and speak. But so the first thing I would say is to educate yourself, and just prepare yourself to listen. I think you have to prepare yourself to listen without judgment, to prepare yourself to listen without commenting or trying to qualify what they have gone through, or even trying to relate to your own. If you haven't had the experience as that young person has, do not try to maybe qualify it or relate it to something, because it is different and you might receive some pushback there. If you have faced the same circumstance as that young person, the same thing, you want to listen without judging. If you've gone through the same thing, you may have more empathy in that situation. You're going to know exactly how they feel, and it's a good opportunity to say, hey, this is what I faced too. And then you want to bring it back to a biblical standpoint. You can use the scripture here that I've used, but there's a lot of scripture. I love, just Jesus saying to love your enemies, and pray for those who persecute you. And you don't, you want to hear people and you want to listen to them and you want to take in their pain and you want to help them deal with their pain, but you don't, without minimizing their pain, of course, but you don't want to leave them in a place of anger and bitterness, because that's where hate comes from. It's when you let anger and bitterness kind of sit in your soul. And that's something that I've had to learn when people have spoken against me, when people have treated me improperly, either because of my gender or my race or for other things. Maybe they just don't like me. But especially when it comes to race and gender, when people are being marginalized in those ways for things that they cannot change.
Yeah.
And that they shouldn't have to change or feel like they have to change.
No. Yeah.
That you want to let them know how to let the peace of God rule in their hearts so that they don't become bitter and angry in that way. And help them to process those emotions in a healthy way, help them find an outlet of some kind. Whatever, if they're an artist, let them paint. If they're do spoken word, help them write some poetry and make a video with them. If they write, help them write an article. If they sing, help them find some songs to cry out and express their emotions, or with their instrument or whatever it is, because I found that to me to be most healing. So I'm a writer, so I wrote. I also am a worshiper. So when I feel that brokenness, I worship. So you want to go and give, you don't want to leave your kids in a place of despair. And
Right.
You want to give them some sort of outlet to express what they're going through. And who knows what influence their expression could have on the people around them. But it's also going to be really healthy and healing for them to be able to do that. And then lastly, I would say, don't let the conversation end with just that one time.
Yeah.
But you want to let them know that you're there with them for like the long run. You want to let them know that you're going to be walking through this with them for the long run, and that if you want to open it up to the rest of the youth group, especially if you've got a diverse youth group, it might be a good idea to say, okay, you know what, is this something you want to deal with the rest of the youth? Is this something that you feel comfortable talking about? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And just re-emphasizing that point of listening and trying to kind of humbly go about it. I learned the hard way because I thought I knew everything, and I thought because my experience was good for me, that's how it should be for everybody. And my lesson came from an 8 or 9 year old camper, and he's probably like late 20s now, but probably changing the world, because he looked at me right in the face and he goes, you don't know, and you'll never know, because you didn't come from the same area that I came from, and you might think you know, but you don't know, you haven't experienced. And he said a lot of very tough things for me to hear, and he was 1,000,000% right. And it's never the same after that. And I'm thankful for that 8 or 9 year old little boy that had to just let it out, for one, and it hurt, like it felt weird and stuff like that. But boy, was he ever right, and changed my perspective on so many things. And I was grateful for that moment.
Yeah, it's good to learn from our kids too. Like, help me understand, teach me what you're going through, because like that, I'm sure, and that's right. Like for a lot of us that have grown up, even if we are people of color, we didn't grow up in a rough neighborhood or in the hood or whatever, we're not going to have the same experience. And so, and just, life is different now. So,
yeah. I also appreciate when kids teach you a lesson, because it's usually far more raw and honest. They don't have as many filters, and it certainly helps me. So you gave practical advice, and you actually kind of talked a little bit about that. About you gave 3 pieces of advice in that article: confront your bias, listen, and educate yourself. How can a church facilitate practicing these tools? That's what I liked. You wrote that these are tools for practice. So how can church facilitate practicing these tools?
Yeah, so the Salvation Army last year put out a great resource called, I think it's like Practicing Sacred Conversations.
Hmm.
And it's a booklet and it's available. And if you don't have it, I can get you the link. It's a PDF and it's, I think, 9 or 10 sessions with guided conversations and guidelines to go through, to help go through with your congregation or a small group, um, to provide a safe space for people to have difficult conversations about this, for people to hear from others that have had different experiences from them, and to be able to look at it from a biblical perspective, but also in I like that there's ground rules that are set for having these conversations. There's some ground rules set for respect. There's ground rules set for who speaks and how they speak and how everybody is supposed to, interact within the group. But there's prayer involved, there's scripture involved, and then there's questions involved in each session that can guide you through having these types of conversations. So I really, that's a really good resource specifically made for the Salvation Army. And in some of the books that I mentioned too, they come with study guides, and they come, so I think it would be really great for a core or a church for non-salvationists that are listening to go through one of these books um, and help you to confront that. And I think it's really good to try to establish a group where you're going to have different points of view. You're going to have maybe mixed gender, mixed culture, ethnicity, nationality, if you're able to. If you're not, that's totally understandable. But if you are able to, I think that would be very beneficial. Brenda Salter McNeil has the Roadmap to Reconciliation.
Yeah, she's great.
It's a great book. She also has resources on her website. I checked some out yesterday, and I think that was really, she has definitions of what things are. And now she's coming out with a Roadmap to Reconciliation 2.0. So even looking beyond that, and it's more of a resource for kind of walking through this as a group. But she also helps people, not just, but everybody confront their biases. Everybody confront the lens through which you look at life. And so I really like that. And then I'm also reading another book, I think, pretty sure it's called Healing Our Broken Humanity. And it's written by a white Australian man and a Korean Canadian woman who now lives in the United States. And so they wrote this book together, and I really like it because there's questions, but those activities to go throughout. Like, so they don't just say repent, but they say, here's a roadmap of how you can corporately and individually repent. Here's a roadmap of how you can write your own laments about these situations. What do you see around you that's causing you pain, and how do you lament over that? It gives you like topics for confronting your bias. So maybe things that the American church has missed in seeing where we're complicit in maybe racism, or where we're complicit in keeping sort of the status quo and not addressing the racism that still exists within the church, or the divisions that still exist within the church. So those are all some really good ways that you can walk through it. There's also a really good, I don't know if you've ever done a privilege walk, but
No, I haven't.
there's a resource on Dr. Brenda Salter McNeil's website that gives you a step-by-step of how to go through this. And I think this reading through some of it was even a little bit eye-opening for me, because you don't often realize where your privilege lies, right?
Yeah.
I didn't, and
Yeah.
so there's some questions in there. Like, some questions are like, if your parents took you to the library and plays and stuff like that, take a step forward, because that's not the reality for everybody,
Yeah.
Like, or there's questions like, if you're the first one to graduate from high school, take a step backward. Things like that help you really assess from a lot of different perspectives, both culturally, for gender, and for socioeconomic status, things that you might not have even thought of. And it's a good way for kids and youth and even adults to silently tell you what's going on in your life.
Yeah.
Because instead of saying, hey, my mom wasn't able to pay my rent this month, they just take a step back. And you can see that, and you can kind of assess. And it's a reading through it again, I thought it was just a really great resource. So the way that it works is everybody kind of starts on the same starting line, and you ask a question. And if it's a question that would help you realize maybe a privilege that you've had in life, you take a step forward. If it's something where you shows like how you've been affected by discrimination or racism or sexism, then you take a step backwards, and you kind of play this game from, or this walk, you do this walk from that point, and then you say go. And so when everybody freezes at the end of this, and then you say go, and then it's like a race to the front. And some people are going to be way closer to the front than others. And then you can kind of talk about, was this race fair?
Yeah.
Right? We
Yeah.
don't all have the same starting lines. And so how do we adjust that? And this kind of adjusted it. Justice, I think what God calls us to do in this world is to bridge the gap and to realize that our starting lines are different. And so how do we change that, first of all, but then how do we help those who are starting from the back instead of the front?
Yeah, that exercise being visual could just say a lot just by simply standing where you are and looking around. It's very, very powerful. We'll be sure to include those links. And I really have appreciated so much of what Dr. Brenda Salter McNeil has put out in some of the blogs, and even some of the messages she's given that I've been able to listen to. Just her approach is incredibly good, and in a weird way, I don't know, it's weird to say, but kind of manageable. You're like, what, this, I could understand this. Sometimes it can be very overwhelming, all of it, and she's got a gift of being able to make it seem like, hey, we could do this, and we could do this together. And, that's quite a gift she's been given. Many of our young people have that we serve have faced some sort of injustice, or are living in kind of a life of injustice. But how should we respond to those that are shared? Because sometimes they're shared, but how do we respond to those that aren't shared? More often than not, they're just not shared. And we talked briefly about those that we don't necessarily see. How do we respond to those?
So when people aren't speaking up about,
or even like when they come in and talk to it, some of it, what you talked about, imagine, is about the listening part, but maybe being able to observe different things in their life and kind of catching that.
So I think with the youth, you never want to pressure somebody into talking, but I think having worked a lot in the field of child abuse, it's an area where people don't want to talk about it because it's like really embarrassing. There's a lot of shame associated with it, and oftentimes when you are a victim of injustice, there is some shame associated with that on your end. When somebody puts you down, like, oh, you're pretty for a Black girl, oh, you're really well spoken for an immigrant, or wow, I'm so surprised that your English is so good. Or, those are little small things, and your kids probably aren't going to tell you every time somebody says that to them.
Right.
But you can address those things when you hear them in a youth group, or when you hear them spoken by others. Maybe they don't feel like they have the courage to speak up, but you can, as a youth leader, set certain ground rules that, like, hey, this is what's acceptable here. This is not what's not acceptable here. And if I hear this, we're putting a stop to it. Addressing some of those things. There's going to be other things like poverty. Most of the people that we serve live in some various level of poverty. If we're doing things right, I think we should be serving people.
Absolutely.
And that's a hard thing to address, but providing resources for people, providing assistance for people in a way that affirms their dignity. I think a lot of times people who are impoverished don't feel like they have any worth. So just asking people like, hey, what are your skills that you have? Focusing on the positive, emphasizing the positive skills that they have. There's other things that you can do if you're in a community where a lot of people don't graduate from high school, by providing them that support, getting them on a path to college, offering mentorship, connecting them to people that are going to help them move forward in their lives, just simply being available and creating a safe space. If you set the tone as a youth leader that this is a safe space, this is a safe space for you to come, this is a safe space for you to talk. These are our rules, these are our guidelines. No one is treated unfairly or differently here, and we're going to talk about things that are happening to you that are unjust. I think you'll slowly begin to see people open up and express those things.
Yeah, and I often find too it opens up for kind of a stronger community as well, for support of each other, because one issue may be someone else's issue that they didn't know that they shared, and to be able to have those and to be in that safe place. I think, sometimes as a youth leader, that's scary to go down that road, because it could be a feeling of just pure inadequacy of being able to handle such heavy things, or just fear of disruption and uncomfortableness, and kind of dealing with that personally. And that's why I really appreciate what you said earlier about going through this process yourself, and kind of dealing with a lot of that kind of stuff. It makes it far less uncomfortable.
Yeah, and for youth leaders, for our youth leaders that have come from the same background as the people they're serving, that's great. But for those, like, if you don't feel like you can emotionally handle, like, it's a lot. Like I said, bring somebody in. You know what I mean. Like, do you have somebody who's a family therapist in your congregation?
Right.
Or do you have a friend who is, like, bring those people in to help them process those things?
Ask for help. There's ever a piece of advice, and youth ministry, ask for help. I think particularly like when you're a young leader, you're like, I can do all of this. I'm going to bring it all up and fight the man and all that kind of stuff. And you're like, I got to quit. This is just too much. And so bring in help, and surround yourself with people that could support you as well. There's an element of mental health that we could talk about. That's kind of another podcast, but with youth leaders and leaders of kind of dealing with that as well. But creating that safe space is so critical to everything we do, because and I think we mentioned a little bit more about a conflicting message, through COVID, where it's been sent out. But when there's a safe space, you get to a real authentic place to do, teaching and processing together as a group. And that's kind of the golden moment, really, that you're looking for. It's incredibly important to fight injustice, and the Army has had just a long history of doing so. And I don't know, I think we could probably argue that we could do more, and I think we could make an easy case that we could be doing more now than what we used to. But why is it so important to our young people?
In the last few days, we've been having conversations, and I've heard so many parents say and just be so brokenhearted because they went through this, but this was not something that they wanted their kids to go through.
Yeah.
And for those of us who serve youth, or those of you listening that have kids, like, you do not want your kids to go through this, right?
No.
Like, this is not something that you want to, like, keep having to explain. Like, for people especially that have Black boys, like, how many times, how many generations can we say, okay, you're getting to that age, and we got to sit down and have the talk. Not everybody's going to see you as harmless. Not everybody's going to see your funny smile like I do. A lot of people are going to see it, and they're going to think you're dangerous. So this is how you have to act when that happens. I think that's why it's so important for us to address this, because we don't want this to be our legacy.
Right.
continual
Yeah.
legacy. I get that sin is a root of sin. The root of racism is hard to remove. The roots of injustice are hard to remove, but it's just like climate change and all these things. Like, this is not what we want to inherit, our youth to inherit from us, right? And so I think that's super important. Why we have to keep fighting for justice. We have to keep fighting for a better place, because we want to leave the world better for our kids, for the next generation. And especially with what I'm seeing from Gen Z, from younger millennials, is that they want change. Like, they didn't grow up. They didn't grow up seeing this stuff. A lot of this is not normal for them. And they're teaching us a lesson. And so we need to listen to them and say, and really change for them, because I don't want to leave things this way for them.
Yeah. Yeah. I saw a real moving clip a couple of days ago of, it was a guy in his 40s and then a guy in his 30s, and the guy in the 40s.
Oh, yeah.
Did you see that clip?
Yeah, I saw the same thing. And then they brought like a 16-year-old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was really powerful. Like, we must not have done it right, I think is what he said. We didn't do it right. And it's you have to be the change. And it's overwhelming and obviously difficult, but I think you're right. I've seen just this kind of movement with the young people of saying, no, this is not okay. And and that gives a great deal of hope and optimism from them. And the more we have conversations about this instead of hiding it, then the more that we could not just empower change, but bring about change, I think.
Yeah. Each of us really has the power to bring about change, just in the daily interactions that we have with people. We have that. So.
If a young person comes to you and asks for help as they want to become more active in fighting a particular injustice, what response or advice would you give them?
I'd ask them, ask them why. Like, why is this cause really touching your heart? What do you want to do? How do you want to be active? And encourage them, of course, to be safe. And depending on the topic, if they're interested in fighting human trafficking, I can say, here's some websites, here's some resources where you can learn about this topic. Here's some ways that as a young person you can engage, like maybe on it with activism, but also practically. Like, don't buy slave chocolate anymore. You know what I mean? I hate that.
That's good advice.
Every time I eat an M&M, I'm like, oh, this is slave chocolate. But you can do things like practical things. If you had a kid that's really concerned about like climate change and our consumerist culture, like, hey, get into some thrift store stuff. Like, shop at thrift stores. Tell people, here's some clothing stores that are making clothes ethically and sustainably. Here's some ways that you can help our environment. Here's some ways that you can get the church into helping our environment, right? Start a recycle campaign or inform people about composting, or, for somebody that is concerned specifically about racial inequity, racial injustice, there are safe ways. Black Lives Matter is probably the most well-known group, but there are other organizations and groups that are fighting mass incarceration, that are providing mentorship for young Black men and women. There are groups that are fighting the death penalty and the inequalities there. And so there's a lot of different facets where you can kind of point people in that direction. Same thing for somebody that's interested in immigration, but it's always good, and maybe you have a friend who does that type of work, who's interested in that if you're not, and you can kind of direct them and give them a mentor so that they can do it, first of all, in a biblical, Christ-like way, and also but help them feel like they are able to do something, because everybody's able to do something, right? I saw the video of a girl, it's like 13, and she's been collecting different like art supplies and kits to send to kids all over who don't have much during COVID. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so like our kids have such powerful ideas, and if we can connect them with something or connect them with some resources, a person to help them and grow in that area.
Yeah, I think the Salvation Army is really situated really well for those type of things as well. I'm a fifth generation Salvationist. I grew up in the Salvation Army. I've worked for the Salvation Army for 20 years, but I still am learning what the Salvation Army can do. It's crazy. Whether it doesn't matter what country or what, there's something significant that might be even a little bit different that the Army is doing that we could connect. And like you said, if you want to dig wells, the Army digs wells in countries. And we have a whole International Social Justice Commission.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just so much. And so again, if you're a youth leader listening to this and your kids have been like, hey, I'm really interested in this, connect those dots and connect them with someone. In the Salvation Army, it's very easy. And so ask one of us and reach out, because we could connect really, really easily. We mock the Salvation Army a lot of times of being a small world and like we know everybody, but there's great strength in that as well. And we could connect people real quickly. So take advantage of that.
Yeah, no, that's great. We have so many structures set up, like our shelters and anti-trafficking things that we do, and all over the world. So that's great advice.
Yeah, it's really amazing. Melissa, thank you for being here. Thank you for I always appreciate your voice and your thought process and how you are able to articulate things so that I could understand. You are an incredibly smart person. I'm not, so that's a good combo for me. Again, we'll try to get as many of these resources in that show links. We talked about quite a bit, but we'll be putting those in. And so check them out. And don't forget to subscribe to the Say Network podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, any of the other ones. I don't know. I put it on like 6 or 7 different ones. So check it out. We'll have 2 more episodes in this season. And Melissa, we're praying for you and your ministry as it's kind of taking a turn to kind of hopefully maybe getting to normal sometime soon.
Yeah.
And praying for your kids and that have lost a lot through all of this and as we're all navigating these very difficult topics and times, and just pray for just wisdom and guidance for you. And I pray that for myself as well, dealing with and processing these times. So thank you for the work that you do, and I will be contacting you further on some other things. I have some other ideas as well. So thank you, Melissa, and goodbye, everybody, and we'll talk to you next time.